Hello, this is Andrew here. Welcome to lecture number 3 in the Digital Games and Contemporary Youth Culture module. In this one, we're going to continue on from lecture 2, something a bit more advanced just in terms of critiquing a game and a game analysis. And we'll take it a little bit of a step further. This will probably be the most philosophical of all the lectures, just to kind of break in the full theory of game and understanding games really, and learning to critique and analyze them and where it's going, I suppose, as much as anything else. There's also quite more video content in this one because it's quite interesting, and there's a lot of good examples out there of people expanding or extrapolating on the theory of games and where they're going. So there'd be a really obvious break along the lines of the theory end of it, really, with ludologists and ludology and people like Jesper Juhl, who look at games and game analysis in a really particular rigid state around the game and the game rules. And then I suppose everything else just in terms of narratology and different where games meet with other sort of art forms like cinema, or just the grammar of cinematic grammar, or the novel even, or a story based sort of logic to it. So we'll just kind of step through it there, and there'll be a few examples along those lines. Sorry, just get my bearings. There we go. Should be. Okay, so yeah, we're just going to outline a few different sort of parameters for how to analyze a game, really. So obviously, the vital part of this is that games need to be played to be understood like that, as much as like watching playthroughs or getting other people's feedback, or just kind of interpreting things like that. You really need to play a game to understand the boundaries of it and see where it frays at the edges, where it breaks, where it repeats, where it doesn't work for you. All these sorts of things, So the first thing would be, just because they're so big and your own perception of them is such a vital part, honing in on what aspect of the game you're going to analyze really is one thing. So if it's the whole game, that's quite an ambitious task. Might involve completing the game, really. Might involve kind of, playing it completing it even a number of times, because there's, some games would have multiple different ways to play through it and how to experience it and reveal it. And each one of those is going to have a knock on, just a user player experience of it. Or, just honing in on one unique game mechanic of the game. So it might be something that's particular to it, be it a new style of animation, a new, just a new controller based sort of, just some level of difficulty in a controller, or some sort of innovation in a genre based game that you might have seen before. So knowing where to start with that is obviously the trick, The vital part of that is not about how good or bad it is. It's just you're looking at the aspects of the game to see, what its merits are and where its failings are. So that's kind of a bit of a big thing there, So it's not just a subjective thing about how you feel about it, or if you are enjoying the game. If the game is boring, or doesn't have your attention, or is too easy or too difficult, or too kind of convoluted, then that's where you would start your analysis from there, just to see why it is that way. And is it, it could be a case that there's some elements that, aren't explained right, or you don't understand, or, there's a number of different things like that. A big thing, because it is such a new area, is a comparative analysis where you're comparing it to other games in the genre. So like if we have a sports-based game, or, a different type of MMO game, what's familiar with it from a previous game like that, and what's the difference? Like, what's the real intrigue here, or where it's going? That's a bit different. So, yeah, just using that as like your focus to kind of see what aspects of it you're looking at would be one big part. Kind of a vital part, I suppose, is who's the game for, like who's the audience, what type of a game is it, and does it appeal to them, and by extension, how much does it exclude other people with that? You know, if it's like a gore-based, violent shoot 'em up game that no one's going to be interested, you know, the people who are into it are really into it, and no one else is going to want that. Or if they have story elements within that game, whatever, you know, there's just different ways to kind of look at who an audience might be, and you know, if it's a really specific audience or if it is something a bit broader. So then looking at the parameters of it, kind of feeding into where we would have, what things we would have discussed in the last lecture about, you know, ideas of gameplay, the rules of the game, the different type of mechanics within the game, and how they affect the user, the player experience of that game, really. That's kind of a vital thing. I'm going to discuss that in a few minutes now about like where it comes to the ideas like difficulty then, and about how a game has to ride this sort of balance between being challenging enough to appeal and not be so challenging that it kind of, or not be so easy that it's just a breeze to complete, you know. So there's a few elements like that. Another thing, I suppose, with the enhancement of graphics and, you know, just the scale and size that games can be into computing and the immersive nature of the environment, is just the full aesthetics of the game, you know, and that can be just how it sounds, because, you know, a lot of these, a lot of so more open world games, you have massive kind of cinematic scores almost accompanying them these days. Along with like other designed audio elements for like a fully immersive environment, and then just like really beautiful graphics or whatever the sort of style of that is. Likewise with the characters, how appealing they are, how grotesque, if that is the case, how realistic, or, you know, how caricatured. So all those things, again, much like, say, you know, any sort of film or animation or anything like that, they'd be kind of an easier relation, I suppose, with those things. Again, just back, I suppose, more on the game mechanics side of just it being a user experience of it, like how the game evolves or how it emerges from the player's experience of the game. And that is like, you know, probably one of the more unique things about how the challenge of the game experience comes together, being a key thing, and that, you know, how unique that can be for each player or each turn that you would take it up with to start playing along those lines. So that's kind of just an overview of like sort of frameworks, I suppose, to kind of look at analyzing a game. I'm going to kind of step out of that again a little bit further. We'll go back to take it out of like a computer-based modern contemporary game thing. We go back to Huizinga, and just to look at what are the characteristics of these environments that would make a game, you know, or a play environment, I suppose. So he'd argue that, you know, it being a free and voluntary environment that you would go into, a vital thing would be separate from everyday reality. You know, it's these ideas that, again, is more towards like the ritualized behavior of a play environment, rather than, you know, it being a unique and different, altered environment to go into, I suppose. So that's kind of the key thing, and I just want to kind of hammer that point of it being a very broad, natural, human, social interaction, rather than something unique to just digital computer games and something that's emerged in the last 50 or 60 years, you know. So yeah, this idea of the magic circle, really, where he sees this sort of a break of the elements of a game or play environment next to a reality, and that being like a key divide between those, and something closer to a ritual environment, really, rather than everyday life being a key thing, you know. So just to kind of just hammer that point really before we move on, just this quote from the Homo Ludens book is quite an interesting one, and this is kind of, it explains the spell, I suppose, of a game environment, or, you know, that sort of play environment, and how thin a veneer it is of something that works and something that doesn't work. So at any moment, an ordinary life may reassert its rights either by an impact from without which interrupts the game, or by an offence against the rules, or else from within, by a collapse of the play spirit, a sobering a disenchantment. So that's kind of a really nice way to put that, where we're basically talking about essentially something equivalent to a spell being broken. So we've some vital theory along these lines of how that works and how that stacks up, and how you can keep people, how you can keep a player in that space. The key one would be probably Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, which is kind of, we discussed it really briefly in the last lecture, but it's this sort of idea of straddling that line of keeping a player within, a flow space, and that being the optimal kind of interaction with a game. Sorry, that came up pretty quick. I have a video of Csikszentmihalyi here explaining this thing, much like Huizinga. It's something which his theory of it and the idea of it has emerged from real lived experiences more than a game environment or something which is being imposed onto a computer game. So it's, that's kind of the interesting thing about how natural and real, I suppose, a lot of these things are in a human sort of reaction sense rather than the game defining it. So we'll watch this video and then I'll come back to you after that.
In Greek meant ecstasy, in Greek meant simply to stand to the side of something. And then it became essentially an analogy for a mental state where you feel that you're not doing your ordinary everyday routines. So ecstasy is essentially a stepping into an alternative reality. And it's interesting, if you think about it, how when we think about the civilizations that we look up to as having been pinnacles of human achievement, whether it's China, Greece, Hindu civilization, or the Mayas or Egyptians, what we know about them is really about their ecstasies, not about their everyday life. We know the temples they built so where people could come to experience a different reality. We know about the circuses, the arenas, sport arenas, the theaters. These are the remains of civilizations, and they are the places that people went to experience life in a more concentrated, more ordered form. Now, this man doesn't need to go to a place like this, which is also, this place, this arena, which is built like a Greek amphitheater, is a place for ecstasy also. We are participating in a reality which is different from that of everyday life that we're used to. But this man doesn't need to go to there. He needs just a piece of paper where he can put down little marks, and as he does that, he can imagine sounds that had not existed before in that particular combination. So once he gets to that point of beginning to create, like Jennifer did in her improvisation, a new reality, that is a moment of ecstasy. He enters that different reality. Now, he says also that this is so intense an experience that it feels almost as if he didn't exist. And that sounds like a kind of a romantic exaggeration, but actually our nervous system is incapable of processing more than about 110 bits of information per second. And in order to hear me and understand what I'm saying, you need to process about 60 bits per second. That's why you can't hear more than two people. You can't understand more than two people talking to you. Well, when you are really involved in this completely engaging process of creating something new, as this man does, he doesn't have enough attention left over to monitor how his body feels or his problems at home. He can't feel even that he's hungry or tired. his body disappears, his identity disappears from his consciousness, because he doesn't have enough attention, like none of us do, to really do well something that requires a lot of concentration, and at the same time to feel that he exists. So existence temporarily suspended. And he says that his hand seems to be moving by itself. Now, I could look at my hand for 2 weeks and I wouldn't feel any awe or wonder, because I can't compose. But so what he's not telling you here, but in other parts of the interview, is that obviously this automatic, spontaneous process that he's describing can only happen to someone who is very well trained and who has developed technique. And it has become a kind of a truism in the study of creativity that you can't be creating anything with less than 10 years of technical knowledge, immersion in a particular field. Whether it's mathematics or music, it takes that long to be able to begin to change something in a way that it's better than what was there before. Now, when that happens, he says the music just flows out. And because all of these people I started interviewing, this was an interview which is over 30 years old, so many of the people describe this as a spontaneous flow that I call this type of experience the flow experience. And it happens in different realms. For instance, a poet describes it in this form. This is by a student of mine who interviewed some of the leading writers and poets in the United States, and it describes the same effortless, spontaneous feeling that you get when you enter into this ecstatic state. This poet describes it as opening a door that floats up in the sky. Very similar description to what Albert Einstein gave as to how he imagined the forces of relativity when he was struggling with trying to understand how it worked. But it happens in other activities. For instance, this is another student of mine, Susan Jackson from Australia, who did work with some of the leading athletes in the world. And you see here in this description of an Olympic skater, the same essential description of the phenomenology of the inner state of the person. You don't think it goes automatically. You merge yourself with the music and so forth. This is an interesting little quote from Masaru Ibuka, who was, at that time, starting out Sony without any money, without a product. They didn't have a product, they didn't have anything, but they had an idea. And the idea he had was to establish a place of work where engineers can feel the joy of technological innovation, be aware of their mission to society, and work to their heart's content. I couldn't improve on this as a good example of how flow enters the workplace. Now, when we do studies, we have, with other colleagues around the world, done over 8,000 interviews of people, from Dominican monks to blind nuns to Himalayan climbers to Navajo shepherds who enjoy their work. And regardless of the culture, regardless of education or whatever, there are these 7 conditions that seem to be there when a person is in flow. There's this focus that once it becomes intense, leads to a sense of ecstasy, a sense of clarity. You know exactly what you want to do from one moment to the other. You get immediate feedback. You know that what you need to do is possible to do, even though difficult. And sense of time disappears. You forget yourself. You feel part of something larger. And once those conditions are present, what you're doing becomes worth doing for its own sake. In our studies, we represent the everyday life of people in this simple scheme, and we can measure this very precisely, actually, because we give people electronic pagers that go off 10 times a day, and whenever they go off, you say what you're doing, how you feel, where you are, what you're thinking about. And two things that we measure is the amount of challenge people experience at that moment and the amount of skills that they feel they have at that moment. So for each person, we can establish a average, which is the center of the diagram. That would be your mean level of challenge and skill, which will be different from that of anybody else. But you have a kind of a set point there, which would be in the middle. If we know what that set point is, we can predict fairly accurately when you will be in flow, and it will be when your challenges are higher than average and skills are higher than average. And you may be doing things very differently from other people, but for everyone, that flow channel, that area there, will be when you are doing what you really like to do.
So that's kind of a quite really fascinating and interesting, but also a nice way to describe those sort of elevated states that come with different different experiences of very different disciplines, that everyone can relate to in some way or another. But I suppose we also, if we're looking at it from the youth work perspective, and in a gaming environment in particular, we all know young people or have met young people who do relate to that same experience and do get that sort of feeling from playing games in a game environment. For the game maker's side, that's the optimal sort of designed environment that you could give to a player, that they can kind of, and this is where we get at it next of like, okay, we know people are all very different, and yet, okay, we can see experientially this is all how it adds up. But if everyone's different and they're all coming to the same game, how can the game developer cater for any myriad of different people with different sort of skills, different experiences with playing games, different physical abilities even to take on the games or to comprehend the environments, or all these sorts of elements that come into play, and how they kind of fit next to that is the challenge on it. I'm going to go on to that now in a more sort of concrete sense of it, but I just want to flag, we've kind of come from the Huizinga, it being related directly to a ritualized environment, I suppose, or, something with a real historical sort of precedence. We can see it here in the flow and just people who are trying to master something, and the whole idea of like being fully challenged and involved at the same time and being able to kind of do the two of them being a pretty vital thing. Sorry, one sec, I just want to stop this. Okay, so on the other side we have that of just people who are mastering something and how they kind of that being the vital components of it really, and how this all pieced together. So we're going to see another thing later on from Espen Arseth, which will be probably the biggest philosophical kind of leap we're going to go on. But again, I suppose if we're talking about working with young people, it's kind of a vital one where you can see this being their first, young people are probably mastering games quicker than they are pianos or any sort of, life skill disciplines or whatever like that. So they have a direct experience with that. The question really is then, what is real? If we're looking at it from this sort of involved environment here where people have, are in a flow with that sort of a challenge and it feels real like that, and it's that sort of expressive environment next to, it being an innate thing in human relations with as we the Huizinga sort of ritualized sense of it like that. This is the question that Arseth's going to pose is like, well then what is real and what is not real in that sort of, if we look at it through those sorts of guises. So it's really fascinating to see where it's going. And they're quite big questions to ask. As I said, I just want to kind of look at a few. That's just the same. We've seen this diagram a couple of times and we've heard it explained by its originator better than I could. So it's all there, and you can see that that's the trajectory of where the skills meet the challenges. being the vital thing. And once those two things are at optimal sort of interchange, then a player is in flow, or a human being is in flow in what they're trying to do, I suppose. So we're going to dump all this back on the game developers then, really, and look at it through the concept of difficulty. This idea of, if everyone is different, how can you cater for them all and make it a play environment where everyone can kind of ideally hit that flow optimal state? So, we'd all be aware of the load up screens of computer games in particular. We'd have like, do you want to play at beginners, intermediate, or expert level, or, some sort of crazy super experienced level, being the obvious sort of thing of setting your level of difficulty next to that. Then the next thing is just in terms of the comprehension of the game environment, how the gameplay emerges, how a player can kind of link with that, how fast and quick the challenges are. Is it too bamboozling and off-putting, or is it something that's exciting and really involving? And then, these sort of questions of like, how much of a challenge is enough before it becomes off-putting? And when does the rewards begin? And if you're getting too easily rewarded, when does it become boring, I suppose? So we look at it just in terms of that sort of description of it. We'll talk about difficulty referring to the amount of skill required by the player to progress through a game experience. Hard difficulty. This quote is more of that sort of physical beginner, intermediate, expert level of it, But in a deeper sense, when we look at the gameplay and the mechanics of it, how do the developers make the game challenge, the whole game environment challenge, and how does that sort of evolve or, allow for a player to react to that? So we'll look at another video now, which is just kind of gonna give you a real feel for that, I suppose, just in terms of the different aspects of difficulty really within a game and how it elevates a game.
Recently, I've been playing a lot of Crypt of the Necrodancer, and it got me thinking about how games choose to implement difficulty. There are a handful of characters in Crypt, each with their own unique style of gameplay. Items and stat upgrades are unlocked as you play, so the game tends to get easier over time. Finally, each level's pacing is dictated by the soundtrack, so increasing the tempo of a level's music means that you move faster, and so do all the monsters. These are just 3 of the ways that game designers can create challenge, and there are endless methods for bringing the right amount of difficulty to complement a game's mechanics. Although difficulty is sometimes an afterthought when considering the player experience, it tends to be a daunting matter. Recall that in our last long form, we discussed how randomness can have wide-reaching effects, so using it incorrectly can destroy even the best game design. In a similar way, difficulty is the key catalyst behind flow, the player state that every developer strives to deliver with their game. It's troubling that difficulty has such a large effect on the end product, because difficulty can be one of the toughest aspects of a game to manage. If you offer only a single level of challenge, the game must be balanced around that point, but you might discourage players whose skill is not within the bell curve. If you offer 2 or 5 or 100 levels of challenge, then the game must be balanced 2 or 5 or 100 different ways, and you've got to spend time adjusting your game to as many different skill levels as you choose. In this analysis, we'll take a look at difficulty as it pertains to the player experience. We'll first try to nail down a good definition of the concept, then explore some of the ways that it can be implemented in a game, regardless of genre. Finally, we'll get into the psychology of game difficulty, and what difficulty means as a silent conversation between developer and player. Because this is such a deep topic, we'll divide up this analysis into 2 separate videos. The first part will delve into setting up our framework and ideas for game difficulty. The second part will complete our framework and demonstrate practical applications. I think we already have a pretty good sense of what difficulty means in the context of a video game, but I want to set a broad definition here that we can use. The word difficulty itself actually means something not easily done, accomplished, or comprehended, but in gaming it's often used to refer to the wide spectrum of all possible challenge options. That is, difficulty in gaming doesn't mean difficult. It means easy, normal, hard, or any variation within. It's best thought of as a synonym of challenge. The difficulty of Cookie Clicker? Very easy. The difficulty of Dark Souls? Very challenging. With this definition, we can examine the relative difficulty options in a single game or compare relative difficulties between two entirely different games. Difficulty is tough to balance, and frequently it's an afterthought in most game design. In other words, the levels and tasks are fleshed out before the nitty-gritty of how much damage this enemy does, or how much experience that monster gives. Difficulty can be as volatile as a bomb, because poor difficulty balance can easily destroy a beautiful game and undermine all of your hard work. If you're designing an RPG, you work on each area first, creating characters and cutscenes to explore a story. The actual numbers and mechanics can be tweaked once you've gotten the core gameplay down. But if 50% of all players' parties wipe in the game's first encounter, you're going to turn off a lot of potential players and stifle word-of-mouth promotion. In this way, you're appealing to a niche market, while your game's promotion appeals to a much larger one. Have you ever seen a film trailer that was strikingly dissimilar to the actual film? This is just one result of the dissonance that poor difficulty can create in a game. If the goal of any game is to resonate somehow within the player, then difficulty can be the fine-tuning or the hacksaw that can cripple that resonance. Most games actively work to induce flow, which is a tightrope walk between difficulty and player skill. We can consider these two aspects of game design to be metagame or emergent properties, meaning that they are born from interactions among basic gameplay concepts. Tetris isn't challenging simply because there are blocks. It's because there are many different block shapes, a limited field of play, and a timer that forces you to make moves quickly. A player that can manage all three is skilled enough to advance on to a more difficult stage, where the challenge is increased further to try and maintain flow. To induce flow, the player progression should be as close as possible to the progression in difficulty. And since a game designer can't change player skill, they're forced to change difficulty to reveal the exact nature of the skill and challenge relationship. If a slight bump in difficulty requires a disproportionate increase in player skill, the game is too hard and flow is interrupted. Instead of the smooth curve or step function that we want, we'll find that we have something that wavers outside of the desired boundaries. While all players will become more skilled over time, not all players will do so at the same rate. What's more is that the proportionality between these two concepts changes at a different rate for every game, perhaps even in different markets. As a designer, this means that you're trying to broadly induce flow by tinkering with individual game mechanics to improve the results in a cohesive system of mechanics. It's a bit like a mathematical function. The only way to tell what the output will be is to tweak the input a little bit, run it through your system, and see what's popped out on the other side. We'll talk about this proportionality between challenge and skill shortly, but keep it in mind as the underlying goal when addressing game difficulty. There are 1,000,001 ways to implement difficulty, and even more ways to balance it. We'll try to stick to the major methods that have persisted in the industry to showcase the big ideas. As far as I know, a widely accepted construct for game difficulty has yet to be created, so everything I'm putting forth here is my own personal way to organize game difficulty. That being said, the way we'll categorize here is not only subjective, but probably inefficient, so if you have any thoughts on a more effective way to examine difficulty, be sure to let us know. Our very first task should be to divide difficulty into two broad categories, mechanical difficulty and conceptual difficulty. In each of these categories, we're now dealing with intended and unintended, as well as the many subsets of each. We'll see that most forms of difficulty can be grouped into one of these four categories, and while the differences between each type are fairly discrete, that line will begin to blur as we get into the details. Joe, the other half of Game Soup, made an excellent suggestion, so we'll further divide examples between rewarding and frustrating, and because any pseudo-academic discussion should try to remain objective, we'll adopt the term incremental for frustrating and decremental for rewarding to further describe our difficulty. Intended mechanical difficulty accounts for the vast majority of all instances of a challenge in a game. It's mechanical because the challenge is based in manipulating confined game mechanics accessible to the player. Broadly speaking, it often takes the form of anything you see on screen that responds to controller input. For example, something as simple as programming the movement in the very first Super Mario Bros. Is a form of adjusting the game's intended mechanical difficulty. Have you ever noticed that Mario has both a speed up and a slow down period each time he walks or runs? It feels natural in this game because it's been matched to the level design. But if you made Mario's acceleration only a fifth of what he normally has, it would take you that much longer to get to full running speed. Suddenly, large jumps are difficult because you didn't have the platform space from a dead stop. In fact, the trope of making an ice level where you slip and slide all over the ground is simply a manipulation of player acceleration and movement. At the other end of this extreme, we can set acceleration arbitrarily high, and Mario will instantly be at full speed when moving, and instantly stop without a gradual change in between. While this may feel more abrupt, it's the factor responsible for creating tight controls, and most of the time, we'd much prefer utilitarian controls to ultra-realistic controls. But most games aren't designed to incorporate this awkward abruptness, and as a result, they have varying levels of player acceleration, player speed, player density, gravity, and many other factors. And remember earlier when we said that poor difficulty balance can be the hacksaw that undermines the experience? Ice physics in a level designed with bottomless pits could prove to be a disaster for the average player by using intentional incremental difficulty. So it's important to balance player animations and movement around the desired challenge.
Okay, so that's kind of the top of a really involved, analysis of difficulty in games from games to, really rigorous sort of analysis of it, which is good to see. I don't want to go into it too much, so we'll cut it off there. But I suppose even the last example there of a game that most people would know, like Super Mario Brothers, which has got, 100 odd different versions of it now of the same game of two, Italian plumbers jumping around in a platform game with, different sort of creatures. And somehow they've managed to make that the difficulty kind of transferable into each of those games to make it as like massively successful as it actually is, which is astonishing in one way, and more credit to the developers of that game to be able to do that. So I suppose in a way the difficulty could be probably looked at as the game challenge of the developers to kind of make that playable, which is not really very different to any other originators of art or different sort of creative forms where it's a user's perception or a user's experience of it is what's going to bring it to life. So it's quite interesting that way, I suppose. But again, I suppose we'll cut it off there where you see the difficulty next to the flow state being the vital kind of components of that in terms of analyzing where a game kind of pales off or becomes really exciting and involving. So that's kind of the trick there. I'm going to split it in half now in terms of the kind of the more conceptual framework of game analysis, the different lines of it where it's kind of so we have narratology and ludology here. Narratology, which refers more to, I suppose, a narrative-based sort of, something closer to other art forms like cinema and, things that are story-based or have characters and are evolved from that. Ludology is something which is kind of, I suppose, really come out of gaming in itself, in computer gaming, and just being a definition, like opposite games, I suppose, rather than some sort of imported sort of analysis or a construct for thinking about games and analysing games. So Jesper Juhl would be one of the main sort of Frasca as well. A few people that would, in terms of looking at ludology, being the vital sort of frame with which to analyze games through, and that being that they have rules and constructs, and that is the vital component of a game, rather than any sort of story element which falls outside of that. And they're just kind of things that come about as a result of the inherent rules of the game, as opposed to be really strict about it like that. Which is good to be, it's good to do it because it really challenges everyone to think about games as a different thing rather than some sort of import of a different, different art forms. So I'm going to kind of get into that now in a minute just to see where, ludology would have come in after earlier games, which would have been, aping on the back of different sort of characters or story-based things, which would have, been more akin to the TV environment or the cinema environments that they would have fallen out, which we would have seen in the last two lectures, really. So it kind of gives a different framework for thinking about that. But also, I'm going to comment on how the narratology aspect of it has kind of come back in a different way, I suppose, just due to the technical nature of games now and how advanced they can actually be, which has allowed for any amount of character story stuff to, kind of surpass cinema in a lot of senses, So, if we look at this, Jesper Juhl's Half Real would be his first big sort of, investigation into this, and trying to define what is a game, what falls outside of a game. And you can see that he was adamant that storytelling and anything like that had nothing to do with a game environment, which is kind of really refreshing to me, to see it that way. So yeah, that's Yule talks about this at length, and has some really interesting analysis of this, just to kind of posit a really, an opposite to, I suppose, how most people would look at games as they would look at cinema or films and stuff like this, and those sort of, or the other grammars that come with different art forms. On the other side of it, we're going to look, there's a video for the narratology, which we're going to get to now in a minute. Sorry, I had everything arranged now in a different way. Just to kind of stay with Yule for a minute, so just to kind of get into this idea of the rule-based aspect of a game, and that being the biggest sort of the most demanding thing of a player environment and a play environment, and opposite that, challenge. And in his most recent book, The Art of Failure, an essay on the pain of playing video games, he's kind of taken that full tilt in one sense of kind of analysing this, I suppose, is the way we're talking about the difficulty of a game next to the inherent rules of a game, and how hard it is to play or complete a game. And this is where the book seems to have emerged out of that idea of being annoyed by not being able to master a game. And that's kind of an interesting concept in itself. We'll take it at face value that, it's the theory side rather than the player in it, who's just kind of like irked by games that he hasn't been able to complete. But anyway, that's the kind of the central premise to that book is this idea of the failure being the vital part of the game, and that being the thing that really has the appeal of, like, you have the very nature of the game demands you will stop it at some time, turn it off. You might save a level. You might go back and play it again and play it different. All these things are essentially fail environments where nothing is there's no completedness in that play state. So that's kind of an interesting sort of take on it. There's a game which I will include in the links at the end about that, Every Day the Same Dream, which he speaks about quite frequently within that sort of, he references that idea, but it's simply a man gets up in the morning, puts on his clothes, doesn't put on his clothes, goes to work, says hello to goodbye to his wife, kisses her, doesn't, gets in traffic, doesn't, walks, whatever, all these sorts of permutations of it, and then comes home and does the same thing the next day. So it is really hammering home that sort of doomed fail environment of a game. So it's, as much as it being something liberating and elevated and something that you can kind of climb into and expand on and get in this flow state, the cruel assumption of the whole lot is that, electricity and technology and sleep get in the way, and all these things that have you turn it off, close it down, go back at it again, or don't if it's too difficult. And it's that element of it being too difficult and how that annoys a player being kind of a vital component there, So it's kind of an interesting idea just to see how, when we speak of games, I suppose it's something quite unique to a game environment and a game analysis and a game theory, which is something emergent rather than a film environment, because you normally would stay till the end of the film and get the full current, experience of that. So it's a unique thing to games, I suppose. So I'm just going to run a quick video giving a rundown on that sort of breakdown between narratology and ludology there, and come back to you after that.
There has been a debate between two groups about the main technique of video game analysis. First group claims that a video game should be analyzed by traditional narrative analyzing techniques, and the other ones who deal with video games should follow the way of narratology. The other group claims that the video game analysis should definitely be separate from narrative analysis, and just like narratology, video game analysis should be analyzed as a separate discipline under the name of ludology. Let's first start with the basic definition of video games. It's basically games that are played with a computer. More detailed definition for a video game would be as having a rule-based system with a variable and quantifiable outcome where different outcomes are assigned different values. The player exerts effort in order to influence the outcome. The player feels emotionally attached to the outcome, and the consequences of the activity are optional and negotiable.
Let's start with narratology. A narrative is different from a story. A story is a sequence of events, known correctly as the plot. Narrative is the way those events are put together to be presented to an audience. Narratology sees every medium as a form of text, like pictures or movies, for example. These do not need to have actual text to be read. The narratological approach also sees video games a broader form of text and thus can be studied using theories of narrative. Every game, even chess, is considered to have a narrative. Here are some terms that narratology questions. Linearity in video games could be referring to the storytelling or the sequence of the story as well as the type of gameplay. Video game genres like front-person shooter games and adventure games tend to be linear games, placing the player on a carefully curated path to narrate a story that has been designed by the game makers. Advancement in the storyline requires a following of a predefined set of actions, which also result in predefined outcomes. Half-Life is an example of these sort of games. In non-linearity, events are portrayed out of a chronological order with multiple distinctive timelines or stories within stories. Traditional media example is flashback. Like linear narrative, this term could be both applied as a reference for the plot of the game or as a type of gameplay. Certain video games allow the player to roam freely and complete tasks in any order he or she desires. GTA 5 is an example. If the story never meets the end, it is called multilinearity. It can be said that narratology approaches video games as a traditional media, just as it is cinema. Furthermore, well-known structuralism approaches are used in the analysis. Obviously, narratology fails to describe and evaluate the interactivity and active relationship with the audience of this interactive medium.
Let's continue with ludology. Ludology is the study of game structure or gameplay as opposed to study of games as narratives or games as visual media. Now we're going to talk about important terms of ludology to have a better understanding of what it is. Game rules are the limitations of player actions, not arguable. Everything player can and cannot do is defined by the rules of the game. Gameplay is the way a game is actually played, while the player tries to overcome the challenges. It is the most valuable element in a video game for ludologists. Player agents describe the ability of a player to interact meaningfully with the game world. More than simple action feedback interactivity, agency refers to knowing actions taken by the player that result in significant changes within the world. The Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, is the one of the video games that has high agency, in which player can directly change the game world around it easily. Game mechanics are methods invoked by agents designed for interaction within the game state. Game mechanics are classified as core mechanics and the others. Core mechanics are essential plays that players perform again and again in a game. It has two classes, primary and secondary. As giving the example of Super Mario Bros., jumping is the primary core mechanic for the game, whereas hitting the enemy is a secondary core mechanic. Without jumping, player cannot finish the game, as sitting is an optional aim. Ludology deals with the terms that are mentioned: game rules, gameplay, player agency, and game mechanics. Ludology actually focuses on the player interactivity of the games and how it evokes feelings of simulacra instead of focusing on the story of the game.
Ludologist Jesper Juhl strongly believes that games should be focused on the gameplay instead of the storytelling. In his article Games Telling Stories, Juhl points out that some of the simplest games contain narrative. He uses the game Space Invaders as an example. Juhl suggests that our basic knowledge of science fiction and the title of the game tell us that the game is about a positive state that is broken by an external evil force, and that the role of the player is to recreate this original positive state. He uses the game Star Wars TIE Fighter to illustrate his original view. Joel believes that the game copy is only a small part of the movie. He also suggests that the title is the main connection between the game and the movie. By removing the title, the connection would not be lost. Henry Jenkins, a narratologist, does not believe the game needs to retell the story of Star Wars to enrich and expand our experience of the Star Wars saga. He further states that the player already knows the story before playing the game. The players would be annoyed if the game was just an exact copy of the original film experience. He suggests that narrative is created within the game through dialogues from the film which occur in the game.
One particular game that particularly backs the ludologist claims is the Super Mario series. Having been around for over 30 years, Mario has featured in over 100 games. In almost all the games that he has starred in, the storyline has basically stayed the same. Someone is kidnapped, Mario sets out to rescue the person, and Mario saves the person. If it wasn't for the imaginative gameplay that has kept reinventing itself, do you really think that Super Mario would be as successful as it has been for 30 years with this basic plot structure? Due to the fact that video games are the medium of interactivity, we claim that each time a player involves to a game, it is a different experience and a different narrative. Every single change in timing and in choice in a video game creates a variety of gameplay action. So, each time one interacts, one plays it differently. It is illogical to deny the narrative in games, but it is more illogical to analyze media games as traditional narratives do. In our opinion, each time a game is played, the outcome is different as a narrative. So, each game playing should be analyzed differently as a different narrative. If you think about it, it has been the same since the first video game was published, and that's why we can play some games, the same games, for many times, even if they are linear or non-linear. We need both narratology and ludology. If we accept this presented approach to narrative and then bring ludology in, analyzing terms such as game rules, gameplay, game mechanics, and player agency, we can end this contradiction and create a healthy and efficient filter that currently rising video game scholars can use and improve. Just to remind everyone, this is just a proposal. Video game is a rapidly growing form of new media, and we wanted to aid it. All we need are well-defined borders of analysis and the validity of scholars. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so there we go. That's kind of interesting to see the visual sides of it. Really, a lot of repetition going on there with what I would have said earlier. But the vital thing being that we have a kind of a split with different sides of the same coin. It being gaming and games, and how they are interpreted or analysed, being something which is kind of being rigorously fought out or teased out in different directions, which only to the benefit of games in themselves and how they evolve. But obviously there's a lot of crossover there as to, when the rules become a story environment, or when a story is setting a different rules, and how this all feeds into a player experience, how it all fits into a flow environment, just feeding it all the way back down the line, I suppose, to see where it's originated from. So I'm going to kind of just take a little bit of a skewed path on it now, just to kind of take all those things combined and throw another thing into the mix then, just in terms of the well, one thing is kind of where we'd spoken about in the previous lectures, and a continuing theme is just the convergence of all these things, and how the accelerated rate that the technology is driving it along. So that's one thing which seems that the narratology seems to be carrying that a little bit more. I'll explain that now in a minute. But also I just want to get back to Arsat in a more philosophical position about like what is real in this sort of stuff. Again, we're just going to go straight into another video then, just to show you. I just want to kind of throw this at just to show this sort of take.
As I said, I am very happy to be here. I should start with the usual caveats that I'm not a philosopher. I never have been a philosopher. My only philosophy exam, I got a C, 2.6, if you know the Norwegian old system. That was the introductory course. So, well, actually, my mother used to call me a sophist. But mothers always speak highly of their children, so I don't take that too seriously. So today I will talk more about things than about philosophy, I suppose. But what kind of things? The main question is, and forgive me if you heard this question before, are computer games and game worlds, are they fictional? Perhaps, if they are, there's some kind of new type of fiction. Not the old kind of fiction, but some sort of new fiction. This has been suggested many times. For instance, back 29 years ago in 1984, Nietzsche and Holland wrote the first article on interactive fiction. Well, they used the term interactive fiction, not for the first time, but they were the first academics to use it. So maybe then games is interactive fiction, that is interactivity and fiction. Jesper Juhl has, of course, famously called games rules and fiction, or rules plus fiction. Chris Bateman recently wrote a book called Imaginary Games, which in a sense is the same duality, the imaginary and something, some gaming. So this is not an unusual combination or perspective on games, which I then, of course, want to challenge. I mean, what could be more fun than challenge such adversaries? So, can a game object be real? Not, as Jesper would claim, the rules, but the objects in the games. Can they be real? That's my argument, or my claim anyway. And of course, then we bring in another interesting term, reality. And of course, I can't really talk about reality because that would take too much time. So let's just go with the only good definition I know by Philip Dick. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. I think that's the best I can come up with. And I trust that Philip K. Dick, I should say, there are probably others, is onto something there. So what I'm going to try to argue for here is a position that I would call ludo-realism, that game objects, game phenomena are real, as opposed to ludo-fictionalism, that game phenomena are fictional. And of course, that same goes for, I will also talk about game worlds. This thing here, do you know it? What game is this? Which game does this come from? Do you know what it is? Anybody? What are these things called? Nobody knows what this is. Good. Okay, so this is actually a real creature. It's called tardigrade, or a water bear. For those of you who speak English. And it is a very tiny creature, less than about 0.5 millimeter, and they live in water everywhere. They're very fond of moss. But of course, until recently, we had no clue they existed because we couldn't see them. Right? This looks like some sort of artificial picture, not like something you would see with your naked eye. So how do we know these things are not fictional? Well, because now we can see them, but through some sort of medium. We can't see them directly, we have to mediate them. So what you see here is, of course, mediated. That doesn't make it less real. It just makes it something we haven't been able to see before. So what looks like a fiction is actually a reality. Recently, somebody made a game out of this, a Tardigochi. So they put a real tardigrade into this nice golden box on the one side over here, and then they put his Tamagotchi equivalent on the other side. And when you feed one through this mechanism here, you also feed the other. So here is, in a sense, two creatures sort of mirroring each other. Of course, one is real. The other we could call perhaps virtual. Or perhaps it is real too. How do we know that something is real? Well, I guess we have to trust ourselves in some way. I don't think there are many other ways to do that. Tamagotchis, well, are they real? Those of you who've seen this example before will forgive me, I hope. But it seems that when we care for our Tamagotchis, and I don't know how many of you have yours with you, probably not so many. How many people have actually owned Tamagotchi? Okay, so you didn't bring them here, right? They're safe at home, I guess. So there must be, you must have taken good care of them before you left, I hope, right? Put them on pause, maybe. So here's an example from a Tamagotchi graveyard. A Tamagotchi graveyard is a place where you bury or you commemorate your dead Tamagotchis. And here's one example from such a graveyard. And of course, these graveyards, well, are they real? They are on the internet, so they must be real. Here's one Tamagotchi, or one owner commemorating her dead Tamagotchi. And the Tamagotchi's name is Gabby. Its age is 11, and you know, of course, that 11 means 11 Tamagotchi years. But how many human years is that? Anybody? How many human time entities is a Tamagotchi year? Nobody? Oh, come on, you know this. It's a day, right? So one Tamagotchi year is one human day. So this Tamagotchi lived for 11 of our days. It is a girl Tamagotchi, Gabby. And this is what the owner wrote about it. I'm so sorry for what I've done. I'm not feeling good because I cried too much because you died. I am so mad at myself. I went to school thinking you were paused at home, but you weren't. I will always remember you, and remember when I had your sound off and I could still hear you. It was scary, but I felt so close to you. Have a great time in Tama Heaven, and remember, I will always remember you in a different way from everyone else that I love close. Now, we could say that this is a fiction. We could say that this Tamagotchi experience is a fictional experience. I would claim that it is not. I would claim that this is something you cannot experience as a fiction, because obviously this is guilt shining through these words, unless we believe it's fake, right? I don't think this is fake. I don't think there's a good reason to claim that it's fake. So I think that this owner have a real feeling for the Tamagotchi, not a fictional feeling, because it's guilt. You don't feel guilt for a fiction. It's nothing personal. It's vicarious. Here is a real feeling, and this relationship is real, not fictional. So, I mean, it may not be Hamlet on the holodeck, but it's certainly very deep. So what is ludo-realism? Well, ludo-realism is then perhaps a combination of different positions. We could talk about something we could call naive ludo-realism. That is, when you experience something like, say, the bot ELISA, where many people, to the ELISA inventors, Weissenbaum's not horror but surprise, felt that this was a real person talking to them. Then that is a sort of a naive ludo-realism, that you believe that whoever you're talking to has some sort of reality, that they're an actual being. Then we have other more sophisticated ways of looking at games as real. For instance, you will remember the famous example, the World of Warcraft funeral raid, where some players attacks other players who are commemorating a dead fellow player in the game. And on YouTube, you'll see these big discussions of how to understand this event. Is it something which is a horrible misdeed towards the people who are commemorating their dead friend, or is it just the way the game should be played? And so in this heated discussion, one player is saying, to another who says that, this isn't real, so why do you make such a fuss about it? He says, define real, moron. I think you're confusing the term real and physical. So here is an interesting player observation that although it is mediated, it's still real. It doesn't have to be physical to be real. Then we can move into our more well-known circles, the academic ones, and talk about perhaps philosophical ludo-realism, where we see virtual worlds and what goes on in them not as separate from our world, but as extensions of our world, and real places where we act and interact. And I mean, this might be seen as some sort of parallel to, for instance, this discussion that game studies have had recently, the move from the magic circle to understanding the special atmosphere of games as in the light of the Goffman's frame theory.
Okay, so we're not going to look into Goffman's frame theory. That's as far as we're going to go along those lines. But fascinating, if you ask me. That's like it's a full keynote speech there. But just to kind of give that idea, again, I'd put it back on anyone who works with young people in particular, to talk about that sort of realities of where people spend their time, or that concept of that idea that real, the experience is real. So where does that fit with the reality? Or, that's just kind of an interesting combination of things. And also that sort of idea of emotions being experienced in there, be it guilt or failure or projections of empathy or, just affinities while in a flow state like that, next to, having rules and boundaries on a game or an immersive environment. And all of that does stack up to kind of, a really interesting sort of situation of multiple readings of it, be it extensions of reality, hidden in plain view, like I'll put the video to the tardigrades and the water bears in the end there as well, because they're fascinating if you don't never heard anything about them. That sort of idea that there are mediated things which are real, and yet we take them, be it from other countries through news sources, phenomena, natural life, flora, fauna that we're not aware of and then we hear exist. So we're constantly in that state already. So it's just kind of fascinating to see it being nailed down in a gaming environment more than most other places. I'm aware of the time there. I'm running over. There's just one more thing I really want to fit in, and then I'm going to leave it at that. But I just want to extend to just show where the narrative aspect of it, or the Ludo narrative idea mixed with new technologies is kind of, I just want to give a few examples of where that's landed, and then we'll finish with Janet Murray, who can explain it better than anyone. But we look at games like this Mafia 3, which, set in New Orleans in the 1960s, a full open world game environment, which is, an immersive state, which the only problem there is have the developers done their homework and how authentic an experience can they make there, But the technology allowing that, and allowing something as immersive of that, whereas the only previous example would have had that in any art sort of sense was possibly cinema or, TV series where they could bring you to a time and a space like that. So it's kind of interesting. Likewise, again, back to the 1979 revolution in Iran, and really fascinating sort of concept, or, for a game or a set of themes for a game. But again, bringing it into a whole other sort of environment, which is kind of fascinating to see that the technology can allow that, and to allow a play environment so big like that. So, that's it. I've one more video, which is basically Janet Murray doing a whistle. It's fascinating, so I'm just going to run it. You can turn off whenever, but if you miss this, you might regret it, because she really lays it out better than anyone else could, I suppose. And then after that, I'm just going to come back to round it off, okay?
As a scholar of the history of narrative, my life changed in the early 1980s when my students showed me Eliza.
Please tell me your problem. What's this all about?
Eliza was a program written by Joseph Weizenbaum in the late 60s to mimic a comically rigid psychologist who mostly echoed back what was said to her.
Wouldn't that be like talking to another human being?
If you could have a perfectly natural dialogue, it's a very big if.
To Weizenbaum's amazement and dismay, people related to this clever pattern-matching program as if it were an actual person.
Well, wouldn't you worry?
Without realizing it, Weizenbaum created a prototype for what would become a key building block for interactive narratives.
Shall we play a game?
The conversation between a computer-based character and a human being.
Good evening, Dave.
How you doing, Hal?
Eliza turned the viewer into an interactor,
Wish I could touch you.
creating the experience of dramatic agency, which is the pleasure we feel when we can actively engage with the fictional world. Storytelling traditions are reused and elaborated over time by other practitioners. I love to give the example of how the Shakespearean soliloquy arose from a crude theatrical device of the violent revenge plays of the period. The villain turning to the audience and saying, "I'm gonna kill that guy." Not a lot of examination of the human condition. But in Shakespeare's hands, it becomes the occasion for Hamlet to bring the audience into the profoundly solitary mind of the newly self-aware modern man.
To be or not to be.
Shakespeare's new building block is the basis of the new digital building block of the confession cam or video block.
But to my mom, the only thing that matters is that I'm single.
Similarly, movies begin as photo plays with a stationary camera and acting styles taken from the melodramatic stage of the 19th century. But they become expressive with the invention over time of what we now take for granted as the language of film. The tracking shot, rack focus, acting for the camera, all of these foundational building blocks which allow us to enter more deeply into the fictional world. Will we someday see the equivalent of Hamlet on the holodeck? A digital story that will be comparable in profundity to Shakespeare's masterpiece, but interactive and immersive like the Star Trek virtual reality chamber? We seem to be headed in that direction. Perhaps the most exciting place right now to see the emerging conventions of a future holodeck is the accelerating convergence of digital television with websites, social media, and games. Digital formats have made TV more immersive, with viewers expecting consistency across multiple seasons and examining every episode in detail.
We have a lot of questions for you, Vince. We're going to pin you down and force you to spit out answers.
The complexity of long-form TV has outpaced our ability to keep track of what's happening on these programs, sending people looking for new ways to navigate and annotate the stories, which I believe will lead to new conventions for following individual threads and catching viewers up on backstory. Writers are collaborating more closely with storytellers from the game industry, allowing viewers to become interactors within clearly defined spaces in the same story world and with the same moral physics. Like the language of film and TV, the language of video games is now transparent to us and can be employed to enter more deeply and empathetically into a wider range of human experience. The experience of dramatic agency can be used to create a sense of immediacy and emotional identification with people in highly particular circumstances, like an African refugee, a preoperative transsexual, a bureaucrat in an oppressive regime, or a drone pilot moving between suburban domesticity and dropping bombs by remote action. These games can seduce us into engaging with situations we might otherwise look away from. And they can offer us the opportunity to reflect on our own values. And because games are replayable, they implicitly pose the question, how could this turn out differently? Why do we need a new genre of storytelling? It's not a matter of more thrilling entertainment. but of stretching human capacities. I believe that we have reached the limit of what we can understand about the world by unisequential formats such as books, movies, and TV shows. As a culture, we are collectively creating the building blocks of a radically new genre of storytelling that allows us to take multiple points of view and to repeat the same scenario to compare alternate possibilities. We're doing this because we desperately need such interactive and immersive stories in order to make sense of the world we live in.
Okay, so that's just kind of a real perfect snapshot of where it's going to go, and it's a good place to kind of break off into the next lecture, which will be on serious games. I suppose the vital message I take on that is the how does this form of stories help us reflect on our own values, and I suppose it's where serious games come in. A few of the examples at the end there, where that's possibly going to play out in a gamified environment full of all these new technologies and interrelated sort of Internet of Everything sort of worlds. We'll pick that up with the next one. Sorry I ran over again. Again, there's just so much to kind of squeeze in there, especially the conceptual end of that. That's as kind of heavy philosophical as we're going to get. I hope it's all useful. Drop me an email to give out about the length of the lecture or if there's any questions in between. And hope all good and talk to you again very soon. Okay, bye.